Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to go over my top fiction books from this year. And it's been a fabulous reading year in many, many ways. And you'll see a few in here from various prizes, but also a few that I've read sort of outside of those prizes. And just generally, I think it's been a very good year for reading, at least for me personally. Also, a fair few of the books from the ones I'll be talking about are from indies and small presses, and I think that is always a really important part of all of this. I think indies and small presses really do so much to make sure that some of the most exciting literature gets out there, and often championing the kinds of voices that you don't always see as much of, or at least some of the perspectives or the more out of the box, not out of the box, out of left field sort of writing that is out there. So I'm really excited to share these with you. There are lots of other books that almost made this but didn't. I've kind of gone back and forth about quite a large number of books on this, but hopefully I think this will feel like a good summary of my reading year, if nothing else. So first up, a book that I read quite early in the year and it's really stuck with me, and that is Human Animal by Seth Insua. And this is a book that takes a moral question at the heart of it, around farming, around ethics, around so many things, and discusses that through two characters, well, another character that's very important later, but through two main characters, a father and child. The father has inherited the farm from his father, who inherited it from his, so on and so forth. And so there's a sense that as a man, you continue this legacy, you become a farmer, you do what is needed of you. The child in this relationship, Tom, has recently returned from university, and they are questioning many things, not only the ethics of being in a farm, but also their identity. They are starting to identify more with being non-binary, and at various parts of the book, we learn a bit more about that, and sort of they end the book being known as Tam, as a more gender-neutral version. And so what we see is a father-child relationship that is quite fractured. But what particularly kicks off a large part of this is a protest at the farm. And it becomes very, very clear that this protest against the farm and its ethics and all these other things is coming from a specific angle. And it becomes even clearer that Tam is linked to this. It's friends of Tam who are involved in this protest. This sets up a whole discussion about sort of an intergenerational discussion, essentially, between father and child, of how they interact with each other, when essentially to question the ethics of farming is also to question your lineage and your inheritance as a family, what the things that your family have done all the way throughout time. I think this is such a gorgeous book. It's so beautifully done. It's so tender and soft. Without spoiling anything, the relationship between the father and Tam, I think, are so beautifully done. There's something so tender in the ways that they both try to understand each other, but also end up sort of shouting over a chasm at each other, just completely not able to meet in the middle. There's also a lot of tension and drama with this plot around the protests and around so many other things. And there's also another subplot that goes alongside this of a prisoner of war who is thinking back to a time when they were in the area. It's a lot going on in a really gorgeous, beautiful way. And I think this book does so well at capturing the really human discussion at the heart of this around ethics, but also the human relationships between father and child, and does this in just such a beautiful way. It really touched me emotionally, and I just think this is such a gorgeous piece of writing. I'm so excited to see what Seth Insua does next with writing. I think this is just going to be a phenomenal writer to follow as well. Next up, we have The Language of Remembering by Patrick Holloway. And this is a really beautifully done book that really looks at language and memory and identity and belonging and so many things in just a really beautiful way. So the book, the premise of the book is that we have Oisin, who has returned to Ireland after having lived in Brazil for a while. Oisin has a child who is being raised speaking both English and Portuguese, and so there's already an interplay there about language and about various other things. But Oisin goes to visit his mother, who is really sort of struggling with Alzheimer's. And what starts to happen is that she starts to speak in Irish. Essentially, parts of her brain are struggling to kind of keep up with where she is, and so she's reverting back to these memories from when she was younger, where she spoke Irish more freely. And so there is a thing coming in here about language and identity and what that really means, because for her, speaking Irish is a fundamental part of her that once Alzheimer's starts challenging some of the other parts of her brain, that part comes through. There's a core there. And this sets up something in Oisin, because he doesn't really speak a great deal of Irish, and so suddenly he's in a situation where for the first time really in his life, he and his mother are speaking different languages, both linguistically and factually, but also in terms of their experiences. There's this gulf that they can't quite cross of being able to speak to each other. And there's something so beautiful, I think, in the way that the book interrogates and plays around with this idea of language and memory and identity, of what does it mean if your mother tongue is something that your family can't understand? What does it mean for the little child of Oisin who is coming into the world and can't communicate with his grandmother in one of the two languages that he knows? These are the two familial languages for him, of English and Portuguese. He is constantly using both languages. The family speaks both of these, but there's this thing that's untouchable in the distance, which is Irish. And so for Oisin, learning bits of Irish to communicate with his mother is a way that he is able to reach across that divide. But the only way to do so is to do that with language. And so I think there's something so beautiful about the way this book does that. And I just really greatly appreciate it. I think this is a phenomenal book. Next up is a book that is so wonderfully left field. And I loved this. Goodlord, an Email by Ella Frears. And so this is a book that, as the title suggests, is written as one long email from a renter to their landlord, well, landlady in this case. And the book is just absolutely absurd, but I think does something really clever with this. So the core idea is something has happened. There are our narrator has been told that she needs to log into a platform to access various things about her tenancy, and there's sort of a suggestion that there'll be price increases and all of these other things. So our narrator is frustrated with this and sends a long email that essentially is just a stream of thoughts. And the whole novel is that one email, basically. And so we see the narrator writing this email, getting increasingly frustrated, but also starting to poke holes in the absurdity of the whole situation. So the absurdity that instead of being able to speak to a landlady directly about somewhere that they're living, that they have to instead go through some kind of portal. And it's this idea of how absurd that can actually be, to do all of this in this really depersonalized way. It also starts to set up the idea of actually how much on a knife edge a lot of people who are renting can feel that they are. You know, that prices can be increased at any moment, things can be taken away, repairs might not be done, all of these sorts of things. And so in some ways this email of a book is an attempt to reach across and understand this, but also to explain the absurdity of all of this, to basically say, look, none of this works, none of this makes any sense. Can you just reach me? Can you communicate with me? Can you connect with me? Because I'm terrified of where I'm living. I am thinking that I'm very reliant on living here, and all of these things affect me. And so this book is kind of wild and absurd, and I just loved it. I thought this was so wonderfully silly on the surface, but actually does something far deeper underneath. And some of the parts that get really silly are, you know, these open-ended questions and sort of ponderings of trying to communicate to this landlady, of saying, I wonder if you do this. When you're at home at night, do you think about this thing? Do you live somewhere safe? Do you watch these kinds of shows? It takes on these weird flights of fancy, but there's something far deeper and in some ways far scarier going on under the hood. And I think that's what's so exceptional about this novel. Next up, we have Ripeness by Sarah Moss. And this is a gorgeous novel that I just love. I love Sarah Moss anyway. She's been a very regular fixture in some of my favourite books from the last few years. And part of the reason for that, or a big part of the reason of that, is that her writing is so dynamic and powerful, whilst also managing to touch on the little tendernesses, the little subtle moments between characters, the ways that people actually interact, I think. And she's always able, I think, to capture how a sort of global event can affect someone on a micro scale, the little decisions they make because of what's happening in the world. And so in this book, we see Edith, who we're mostly focused on, and it's the 1960s. She goes to visit her sister, Lydia, who is pregnant. And this is on command of her mother. Her mother says, you've got to go and see your sister and help her. And the main thing, it seems to be here then, a discussion around what is going to happen with this baby. Lydia is definite that she does not want to keep this baby, that she will happily, well, not that happily, but she will give birth to the baby and then she will immediately give this child away. She is dead set on this. It's sort of nodded at a couple of times that this is linked to her also being a dancer, that there's a sense that she wants to get back to dancing and have her life and her body back. But there's something that feels deeper going on here. And some of the most chilling passages, I think, are Lydia talking about her relationship to this child and the way that she doesn't even want to see the child after they've been born. She doesn't want to interact with them. She just wants to give birth and then know that this is being taken care of. And this is Edith's job that's given to her, to make the call to do this. We then move forward into sort of closer to the current day. And in this part of the timeline, Edith is living a very different kind of life, but is still to some degree haunted by some of what's happened before her. And without spoiling anything, this is where the book then starts to mobilize into the idea of what it can mean to make a decision a long time ago and then have that decision show up later in life. And so there are so many things that go into this, and I think is just so beautifully done. But what I think is incredibly special about this novel is the way that it takes this very focused story of these two women and their choices, and the conversations they have, and then brings it out into the modern day and with various historical bits going on. So what starts to come up in this book is a discussion about migration and identity and belonging. And so we have a sense of, for example, in the book, how Jewish characters have had to move and flee and change where they are across history. We then see what this looks like in a more modern day setting with Ukrainian refugees, and that then being a point of discussion in this book. And what really then gets set up is this idea of how there is a sense of history coming in cycles. There is the idea of history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And something really beautiful comes up in the way that this book examines that in a really heartfelt way of somebody speaking out about one of these groups and being chided because actually, are we not thinking about the humanity of this group here? And there's something else that I think is just so beautiful to it, which is just the way that this book organically lets these characters make mistakes, be quite messy, and it feels very much representative of real life. These feel like real people who are forced to make decisions or who choose to make decisions that feel particularly horrible or difficult in some way. And so I think this book is just so special for the way it's able to capture that with nuance and with heart. Next up, a very short but incredibly beautiful and heartfelt novel, A Room Above a Shop by Anthony Shapland. And this is just such a beautiful book. This is a book where there are two men who, as the title suggests, eventually come to be living above a shop in Wales. And this book grows with such beautiful silence and quiet throughout. It's a book that is done so subtly and so tenderly. So we see these two men in a very small town or small village come to meet each other and eventually understand that they might be interested in each other. They slowly intertwine their lives. They move in together. There is a sense that they are sort of bonded in some way. People in the village might sort of have a sense of them being together, but they also don't necessarily say anything. They, for the most part, let people get on with what's happening. There are moments where this is very much not the case. But what I think is just so exceptional about this book is just the way that it uses space and pauses and silence to communicate so much. This is a book that is also largely about Section 28, which is a time in UK history where there was a policy that particularly certain services, local council ones, were not allowed to be seen as quote unquote promoting homosexuality. And what this really meant was people being living their lives in silence. You were never out, you didn't really talk about it, you tried to shield as much as you could. And this went on for about 15 years in the UK, from 88 to 2003. And so this book sort of works within that time frame. There's a sense of secrets are things, or your sexuality or your lives are things that you very much keep under wraps. They are secret because to reveal that secret is dangerous. It is a weapon for somebody else to use against you. And in the face of that, we see characters like these who live this very quiet, tender kind of relationship and love that cannot be expressed in a bigger way outside. And indeed, they are then victims of the times, with people particularly thinking that they might be HIV positive, because that was another big concern of the time. And so there's something about the way that these characters are living in a world that is at times incredibly hostile to them. And so they have this room above a shop, this one area where they can be safe with each other, where they can speak slightly more freely, where they can do what they need to be together, because that's their one little sort of moment, their one little area of security, their little sanctuary, and the rest of the world feels like the more complicated thing. I just think this is a triumph. This is one of the most touching books I've read this year, and it really, I just think, deserves a lot of love. I just think this is so sensitively written. It has such a lightness of touch to it, and that means that any of the more dramatic big moments that happen feel utterly heartbreaking because they are given the space to breathe. They sound so loud against the quietness of this book. I think this is such a triumph. I love this book. Next up, another book with just such a gorgeous relationship at its core, and that is The Two Roberts by Damian Barr. It's so tenderly and lovingly written, but also has so much research behind it, because the two Roberts in this book were real men. They were two artists who met in like an art school in Scotland, and went on to both have their own artistic careers, but to also live this really beautiful and interesting and fascinating and raucous life together. We see in the book the two men meeting, and the ways that they slowly, in many ways similar to a room above a shop, have their one quiet space where they can be who they are. And what starts to blossom out of this is not only two fantastic artists, but we also see these two men live this incredibly wild life where they are suddenly incredibly famous as artists, and suddenly very celebrated, and suddenly there's money coming in left, right and centre, and fame, and all of these invites to the sort of demi-monde of exciting worlds of everything, and then how quickly that money and fame and everything else can also be withdrawn. And so we see these two men through a real roller coaster of a life, but the constant between them both is their love and the way that they look out for each other. It is so gorgeously done. This book just, I just found myself so invested in their stories, and I had to remind myself several times that these were real people. And there's something so beautiful about watching where Damian Barr has found real life things from them, letters or gifts or things around their flats or whatever, and has spun stories out of them that feel very authentic to this. These are very carefully researched, and so what you end up with is just this very beautiful story that's so big-hearted. It's so tender and gorgeous. There are some really deeply funny and silly moments in this, and just so many things that I just found utterly charming. What a gift, really, to be able to give these two men and their story a life now, but also without spoiling anything. The way the book approaches the end, I think, just does something so utterly beautiful of a way of how we can remember these two men and their legacy and everything else. It's such a triumph. This is such a gorgeous and generous book. It's such a big hug of a book, and I really strongly urge you to read it. Next up, before the next few books, which will be very much Booker and International Booker related, this book, which did receive some prize nods of its own, but I just think is brilliant anyway, Helm by Sarah Hall. And this book takes a really unique perspective, and I think that's what I really adored about it. It's a book that is told essentially through a main character who is the wind, and particularly the sort of wind spirit who would be blamed for various things, or who would be seen as a particular phenomenon. So the way that something bad could be blamed on the wind of, oh, there's a weird storm today, and that is what's making people act irrationally, or there's this other thing happening, and that's what's making my cows uneasy, or whatever. And so Helm itself takes on this sort of quasi spiritual role of being this thing that people curse at or talk about, and this kind of a phenomenon that people study. And actually Helm in their voice says that this is absurd, that humans are trying to study and pin down something like the wind, to understand it, to put digits and numbers and data alongside it, and that's something undoable because it's the wind, it's this mystical being, it's this thing. And so the Helm at one point sort of slightly wryly says, well, I'm really flattered that humans are trying to understand me, but you'll never do that. And so I think this book, just as a result, we follow a few sets of human characters and the ways that their lives interact with this wind and the various things that happen in their lives. But there's something so special about this because the wind obviously is something that sees all of history. So for the wind, they can laugh at the fact that there are people, sort of cavemen at the beginning of its existence, all the way to modern day people. But for the wind, that's just a blink of an eye. That's something very small and tangential. And I just think this is such a wildly imaginative book to tell a story of nature in this way. I just think it's really phenomenal and just such a fun book. It's really funny at times, really silly and absurd, but also incredibly poignant other moments as well. I just really love this. I think this is fantastic. And yeah, I just absolutely adored this. Next up, as I mentioned, we get into Booker Prize territory. And let's start with the International Booker Prize. I really loved the long list and short list from this year. And some of the books that came up from that were just so special to me in so many ways. So a few of them will appear here. I couldn't put all of them, but there, a fair few of them come up. And this is a bit of a 2-for-1, which is Solvej Balle with On the Calculation of Volumes 1 and 2. And this is translated by Barbara J. Haveland. I've accidentally mixed things up here by having a US cover and a UK cover between 1 and 2, which I realise might annoy some people. So I don't know how I'll carry on holding them up, but please, yeah, apologies if that's annoying for you. But these books focus around this idea of a character being stuck in the same day. And Tara is her name, and she is stuck in the 18th of November. And so what happens at the beginning of volume 1 is she, in many ways, starts to try and tease out what has happened. She is trying to understand how it can be that she keeps on waking up in the same day, carrying over the same information and anything that she's learned from previous days, but nobody else in that world around her is changing. Everything runs to the same schedule as it did before. So she starts to play around with this concept. She will try and do something earlier in the day to see if she can intercept something or move something and make it different. She will see, for example, that because of the weather on that day, she will dress differently to make sure that she is ready, which she hadn't been perhaps on her first time on the 18th of November. But as time goes on, she starts to become more and more frustrated because she is stuck in this cycle in a way that is increasingly infuriating for her, because it basically starts to make her relationship, even with her boyfriend, incredibly tricky, because she is watching as he is saying and doing the same things. She is more and more frustrated with him, is feeling more of a sense of boredom with him, but for him, nothing has changed. Even if the clocks went back to being as they had been the day before, even if time started moving forward again, she would be a year away, a year ahead of him. She would be in a situation where she no longer wants to be around this man, and she's had a whole year of resentment that he has simply not had. And I think what starts to build up between the first and the second book, and then I hear from the third, which I've not read yet, is the way that she continues to build on this idea. So, for example, she starts to play around with the idea of how far she can go. So in the second book, she starts to experiment with that, of doing things like seeing if she can just continuously travel more and more. Will she be reset back when she wakes up the next morning? What will happen if she keeps on moving? Particularly in the second book, she's really keen to see water, to see the beach. She's really keen to see different kinds of weather. And so she keeps on moving so she's able to do that. But in the meantime, she is just continuously stuck in these moments. And what we're seeing is just these diary excerpts, essentially, of her going through this. It's such an inventive concept. And it would be so easy for this to fall apart about 50 pages in and become incredibly dull and monotonous. But somehow there's something that keeps it together, which I just think is utterly brilliant. There's something utterly compelling about reading her living the same day again and again. And I'm so excited to read the rest of them. I think there are due to be 7 books as well. So yeah, we shall see. Next up, from the same International Booker long list, we have The Book of Disappearance by Ibtisam Azem and translated by Sinan Antoon. And this book, I think, is so vital and important in so many ways, but also I think probably one of the most striking and bold books I've read this year. The core concept, this is set in Palestine and Israel, and the book starts with the concept of one day everybody wakes up and all of the Palestinians in and around Israel vanish spontaneously overnight. No like bodies, no sort of other things happening. They just disappear. They cease to be in this really interesting way. And so what starts to happen is then the book focuses on what people then do next. So we have some people who are sad and horrified, who are, maybe are missing their neighbors, or who are really worried for what might have happened. But we also see a really callous media, and particularly government in this case, who start to treat this as a victory, as something to celebrate, essentially along the lines of, well, we wanted this to happen for years and now look, it's finally here. And what then starts to happen is the government, particularly in the media, don't know what to do next, because so much of the narrative and the rhetoric has been around Palestinians as a second-class citizen and as an other. And so if you've removed your enemy from this conversation, if you no longer have someone to point at and say they're the reason this thing is happening in our country, then what happens next? And we see the government start to cave in on itself, where the government starts to attack other groups. So it chooses a different sort of minority, in this case a minority Jewish group in Israel, to target next. And we see how essentially that engine that we see in many governments and in many other sort of human interactions across the world, where having an enemy is the thing that is done to allow political rhetoric. And we see what starts to happen, where the nation starts to some degree to fall apart, because now we don't know who to target next. We haven't found the next person or the next group who we can blame for everything. And I just think this is such a, I think I said in my solo review of this book feels like staring down the barrel of a gun, in the sense that this is such a bold piece of writing, I think, to take something very real in terms of the oppression of Palestinians, and to flip on its head what would happen if they disappeared, to take that almost as a speculative piece of fiction and say, well, what would happen next if you had this dream of a second class being removed entirely? It's so bold and so clever as a novel, I think. And I think as a result pulls out some really important discussions about the ways that humans can treat other humans. And particularly, I think, has had extra resonance in the last couple of years. So yeah, I just think this is a really stunning piece of writing that is difficult and challenging, but also at the same time, I think, incredibly powerful. Next up, we have Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico, translated by Sophie Hughes, from the same International Booker Prize longlist. And this book, I think, is another very wry and clever takedown. It's a book set around a couple, Anna and Tom, who live in Berlin and particularly have chased the dream of Berlin of being young 20-something professionals who can enjoy a sort of hipstery, trendy lifestyle of living, doing freelance work and having their own businesses potentially and doing all of these things, living the Berlin life, and then, making the most of it, essentially doing everything correctly, as it were, this sort of tick list of how to be a successful, popular or whatever, millennial sort of person. And what then happens, I think, is this book starts to play around and subvert this. And right from the jump, we are told essentially that this book is going to play around with the silliness of this. So the first opening pages are this lush, beautiful description of this flat that's so perfectly curated and arranged, and it has this beautiful, these beautiful wooden surfaces and this gorgeous chair and these perfect plants and everything. And then we find out that this is an Airbnb listing and that this is the way that they are selling this flat in Berlin, where trying to rent somewhere is is incredibly challenging because there are so many people who want to live there because it's so, it's seen as so attractive as a proposition. And so this book then carries on playing around with this and subverting this idea of what it means to really be perfect, to have perfection. Because Anna and Tom, this couple, over time become incredibly frustrated or bored of the lifestyle. They go out less, they take in less of Berlin, and what they're really doing is working longer hours. They at one point start their own business, and we just have this scene of them working together in the flat, barely talking to each other, wearing lots of clothing because they can't afford to have the heating on, doing longer and longer hours, socializing less and less, finding that the nature of everything around them is really transitory, where they will meet people who are new to Berlin, they'll spend a couple of hangouts with them and then never see them again. And this just keeps on happening, and there's this churn of people coming in and out of Berlin. And towards the end of the book, it carries on playing around with subverting this, where there's an idea that they might then move to another place entirely and leave Berlin. But to do so means also giving up a rental apartment that is almost impossible to get hold of. So they almost want to keep a foot in the door and keep that as part of Airbnb, but then to do so carries on the same problem. And so this book just has this sense of gentrification and a millennial dream that is sold to people, but that is perhaps not attainable or perhaps not forever. And I just think this book is so wry and clever in the way that it undermines this dream, whilst letting these characters live this lifestyle that just becomes increasingly unexciting for them both. I just think this is such a funny book at its core, whilst also being incredibly tragic, really, in parts as well. I think this is brilliant. Next up, onto the Booker Prize, and a book that was longlisted and unfortunately I think didn't make it to the shortlist, but is just a book that's really stuck with me as well. So we have Seascraper by Benjamin Wood. And so we have a young man whose name is Thomas, and he is living in this small town in the north of England on the coast. There's a relative amount of deprivation, and he is doing very sort of physical work. We see him start the book essentially having inherited a job or a kind of a way of living from his forefathers. And this has meant that he essentially just does a lot of physical work for not very much money to just try and keep the house going. It's not a particularly glamorous lifestyle. He seems relatively happy and is relatively stoic, but there's also, it's clear that he has other dreams as well. He wants to become a folk musician. He wants to do all these other things. And so he is moving through this world, just kind of living bit by bit. And a Hollywood, director or somebody involved in Hollywood as a bit of a scout comes down to this town and looks around and basically realizes it might be perfect for a film that they're going to shoot. And so he starts selling this big dream of, look how much money you could make. We could do all of these things together, and to do so would really make your life so different. And he is quite resistant to parts of this, but also understands a necessity in this, particularly when he's offered a really large sum of money to also be part of the crew, to help them scout out new areas. And what starts to happen is there's a transformation here of what his life could be and how he may be able to escape various cycles. There's also another part of a plot about him trying to connect with his father, who he hasn't seen for a while. And particularly that takes place in this very dreamlike, surreal way. And so the book is just this really beautiful sort of evocation of that, of place, of belonging, of identity, and like how you can follow on something throughout a history, how you can be to some degree forced to carry on living a life that your forefathers have because that's just what's expected from you. But also, do you want that? But is there something very comforting about that too? And so it's just a really beautiful book, with some real moments of wry humor and silliness to it as well. But it's just a very, it's one of those books that just you live in for the time that you're reading it. It just has a real, there's such a special way that this book communicates this sense of place. There's a quietness to some of the writing, I just think is really, really gorgeous. It's just such a lovely and sort of thought-provoking book, and I think also resists the urge to do something that many other books do, and instead just keeps this very spare and quiet and haunting. Last but not least, we have the winner of this year's Booker Prize, Flesh by David Szalay. And in this book, I just think it does so much, so interestingly. This book follows a man called Istvan, who at a fairly young age, I think when he's a teenager, has a few interactions, without spoiling things, that change the whole course of his life. He essentially has some kind of criminal record, and he wants to avoid putting a foot wrong again. And this is where I think the real beauty of the book comes in. This book is told in a very clipped, removed, stoic kind of style, where he almost, it feels like Istvan wants to tell you the smallest amount of the story that he can get away with. And so it's a book that's incredibly spare at times, where his dialogue, and I know some people have disliked the book for this reason, and I get it, but his dialogue often involves him just saying the word okay and saying very, very little else. And we see that when he moves from Hungary to London, so much of his life is seen as then he's going to make it, he's going to have this whole new life. Whereas really what he kind of just does is plug away at working. He essentially, it becomes an interesting discussion around masculinity and maleness, because he is moving through the world doing what is seen as the expected thing for him as a man. He keeps his head down, he doesn't reveal much, he doesn't really talk about feelings. And we see how this harms him throughout the book, that he really struggles to connect with a lot of other people in his life. He takes on jobs that are in some ways perfect for somebody like him, that involve either crime or secrets or whatever else. And he's able to do that because he is in some ways a grey man, somebody who you don't see or really acknowledge, because he's so uncommunicative and so determined to not be understood. And so he carries on moving through this world, but we see how so much of his life are these really big moments, but he cannot ever reveal these to you almost. There will sometimes be moments between chapters where you learn that 3 or 4 or 5 years have gone by and major life moments have happened, but it's never commented on apart from a very brief glance at something. So, you know, I did this thing happened, and you find out someone's been married, and you only find that out through a throwaway remark by somebody else, or potentially by him, but he seemingly doesn't want to tell you the story. And I think that's what this book's kind of quiet brilliance is that this book is not concerned with making this pretty. It's a book where in some ways the form and function naturally work together, where he is so keen to tell you a bit about his, to keep the story moving, but not to tell you anything about what is actually happening for him. And that's what I think is the genius of this book, and why I think this is a very, very worthy winner for the Booker Prize this year. I just think this is a really, really clever piece of writing. So those are my top books for the year. There were so many others I wanted to include, and I will just give a very quick honourable mention here. In some ways, this book could have absolutely been in this. I've gone back and forward with moving books around. The Expansion Project by Ben Pester is the sort of honorary one here. It's an incredibly brilliant book that plays around with what's true and what's not. It's very Kafkaesque, and it's all set around the idea of this workplace, the Expansion Project, being terrifying. And a big part of what makes it terrifying, apart from never knowing what's true or not, is the fact that corporate speak is in some ways the biggest horror of them all. It's a really brilliant book that's very funny, whilst also being utterly heartbreaking at the same time. I just think it's great. It's a fabulous, fabulous book. So after that edition, thank you for stopping by and listening to me ramble on about my favourite fiction books from the year. I hope you've enjoyed some of these books. I hope if not, these are also some of the books that you might consider picking up. I think they're all very, very much worth your time. And I hope you have had a wonderful year of reading too. Thank you all so much for watching my videos and stuff throughout the year. I hope you have a wonderful break, whatever you're doing. Take care and speak to you all very soon. Bye-bye.